dive time, everybody. We are going to be talking about the German economy in the post-World War II, post-Cold War age, how we got to where it is now, their booms, their busts, and their current dilemmas.
Absolutely.
So let's start from the end of World War II. With the Nazi-controlled government, there were a lot of privatization schemes and state interventions. There were implementations of certain price controls. There were government-directed contracts. There were a lot of state interventions in the economy. There were the complete abandonment of trade unions entirely in the Nazi government. So there was a lot of mixed economic models going on in the Nazi regime. A lot of people describe it, historians will describe it as basically the Nazis doing whatever it did to keep the party in power. There was really no ideological cohesion to their economic policy. It was just what was going to make them the most empowered. Mm-hmm. So after the fall of Nazi Germany, basically German industrial output bottoms out, right? Drops by 50%, some crazy numbers, and they need to start the process of rebuilding. Now, for the purposes of this analysis, I'm going to speak mostly towards West Germany, because that's where the most of the interesting political infighting takes place. And so there are two different models of economic development post the Nazi age. There is the social democratic element there, which is emphasizing economic democracy, and then there's the more liberal neoliberal path towards the social conscious free market. And these are the two individual ideological sides and economic modes that the country will be choosing to go down the path of. Okay. So this is the SPD's program of economic democracy. They wanted a decentralized planning system that was held together through public ownership of major industries and heavy industries, with an equal influence of unions on corporate bodies.
Okay, and to be clear, SPD is like the current left-leaning political party in Germany.
Yes, that is the Social Democratic Party of Germany, right? Yes. So that's the SPD. This was building off of an international consensus, right? They saw what was going on in the U.S. with the New Deal and the expansion of the welfare state and union rights. Mm-hmm. They saw what was going on in the United Kingdom with the Labour government of George Clemenceau. George Clemenceau? No, that was a French prime minister. Bernard Attlee. Attlee was the prime minister after Winston Churchill. Okay. So Attlee was the creation of the National Health Service. You saw these massive expansions of state intervention in the economy, and the SPD wanted to carry that into Germany. They wanted to focus mainly on full employment. That was the SPD's focus. They were focusing on full employment, and they were going to be okay with getting this through state interventions and state directions. Mm-hmm. This mode was supported by the UK, most Americans, unions, and honestly, some manufacturing leaders in the company as well. They also wanted to continue with the price controls developed in the end stages of the Weimar Republic that were kept going through the Nazi age.
Interesting.
And they wanted to, but this was despite failures in that already being seen, right? They knew that a black market was developing because of these price controls, okay, but they wanted to power through that with hopefully an increase in production, which would balance out the pricing.
So they wanted to keep price controls because they didn't want prices and thus revenue that they could use as wages to be dictated by competition and of how productive companies could become. Is that your understanding?
Well, they didn't want price controls because they didn't want the working class to get priced out of necessary goods. They they preferred a queue system of waiting online to get that good at that price rather than just chasing after the price of whatever it floats to.
Okay, rather than letting demand drive supply up.
Yeah.
Okay, so so black market prices were higher.
Yes, they were going to do state intervention to get production up.
Okay.
Right? They didn't want to do the demand incentivized production up of prices going up.
Sure.
You see what I mean?
Yeah.
Now, the socially conscious free market was a totally different plan. Well, that's actually of historical contention, but we'll get to that. So, this approach was not laissez-faire. It was not totally free market. The people who were pro-socially conscious free markets actually sometimes came from socialist backgrounds, but they were not socialist by any means. They were very much neoliberal. We've talked about in our deep dive of neoliberalism, we talked about how F.A. Hayek actually came from a somewhat socialist background. And he kind of had some of his ideas where he was okay with a public healthcare system and stuff like that. Yeah. Right? So he was definitely not laissez-faire. He wanted government to promote competition. He wanted a strong antitrust program. The socially conscious free market wanted a strong antitrust program, and he wanted to keep the market free of monopoly, public or private. They didn't matter.
Yeah, it does sound very familiar to our neoliberal conversation. It's like it's not less state. It's use the power of the state to ensure a market and an economy that works in a way that maximizes productivity and social well-being.
Yes, they also wanted to implement a graduated income tax, or not implement it, but keep it. They just wanted to cut the middle portion of the graduated income tax lower. So they wanted middle class reductions with keeping like 95% taxes on the rich.
What is a graduated income tax?
So graduated income tax is if you make $20,000, you pay nothing. If you pay $30,000, you pay 10. If you make $40,000, you pay 20.
Okay.
And it goes up and up and up.
Okay.
So yeah.
So like how we have here.
Sure. Yes.
Okay.
Exactly. Like our current taxing system. But they had 95% taxes on people making over like 200 grand in Germany. Now they cut it to like, I think it was like 45% for people making over 200 grand.
It's a massive cut.
And then kept 95% for people making over $1 million or something like that.
Okay.
That was the socially conscious free market approach.
Okay.
The plan was also to create a new currency, which rings very, very close to home with our current understanding of what's going on in Argentina. To curb problems with inflation, they wanted to scrap the currency and start over. And they wanted to focus on monetary stability over full employment. So when we talk about economics in the Federal Reserve has two mandates in the United States: to have full employment and to keep the dollar stable. That seemed to be a floating and what's the word that I'm looking for? Conflicting relationship. Conflicting, inverse relationship. When one goes up, the other goes down. You know what I mean? So these are the two sides of the coin, which makes a lot of sense, because in our neoliberal discussion, a lot of it was John Maynard Keynes versus F.A. Hayek. And F.A. Hayek was all about the monetarist theory of inflation. And then Maynard Keynes thought of everything in the terms of full employment, of get the country roaring, get production up through state intervention and deficit spending, right? Yeah. Two very different views. So the socially conscious free market side ends up winning out. And they are the ones that gets their policy implemented. And so Ludwig Erhard becomes the economy minister. And he is in a coalition of other liberal parties. He was in the CDU.
Okay.
So now this is about to lead into the fastest growth that Germany has ever seen in the modern world. This is about to be Germany's boom. And a lot of historical debate and a lot of historical arguments center around what caused this boom. What caused the quote-unquote German miracle? That is a question that historians and economists have been trying to answer forever, and I'm going to give you both sides of that argument and kind of where I land on it at the end. So just to summarize here, Earnhardt, when he gets into power, I want to go over what he does. 3 major things. He does the currency law of 1948. He scraps the currency, gets rid of another one. He exchanges 100 old Deutschmarks for 6.5 new Deutschmarks. So 100 to 6.5, okay? He gave economic authorities to take the necessary measures in the field of control and to determine in detail which goods and production should be freed from price controls. So he basically dropped a lot of price controls. Notably, he didn't drop all price controls. He kept rent controls and he kept agricultural product controls. So he kept food price controls, and he kept rent controls in place, but he got rid of the other ones.
Okay.
Actually, he didn't get rid of coal either, but I'll get into that in a second. But the most important part about his government and his legacy and the overall, I shouldn't say fantasy, but the folklore conception of the German miracle really boils down to this last bullet. He consistently balanced budgets through the entire reform period. And a lot of the German miracle is tied to that belief and that understanding that the budgets were balanced when Germany's growth was high. That was a fundamental ideological goal and basis for movements to come around monetarist and neoliberal policy going forward.
Yeah, and we've already talked about, obviously, this is an extremely important thing to remember, because in the recent conversations we've been having about Germany, it is all of their thoughts about what to do for their economy have this underlying basis of we need to stay fiscally sound and responsible as far as having a balanced budget and not taking on too much debt.
Exactly. And it comes from Erhard in this 1948 reform period. So now let's look at the economic growth for this time period. In the time of the German production boom, 1948 to 1960, their average growth rate was 8.2%. From 1960 to 1970, it was 4.4.
Okay.
So we saw a 50% reduction after this decade. And then 1970 to 1880, it goes down to 2.9.
You said 1880. What? 1970 to 1980.
Yeah. 1980 to 1990, 2.6, blah, blah, blah. And then it goes down to averaging about 1% growth.
Yeah.
So this was the boom period. And people want to understand why this boom happened. Why did this boom happen? If the SPD won out, would this boom have happened? If economic democracy happened in West Germany, would the same growth have happened? That's a question that economists have been trying to answer forever.
Yeah. Was the balanced budget, does it deserve as much credit as it gets for fueling the economy?
Exactly. Was that the main reason?
Yeah.
So I want to go into one study that was done by the Cato Institute to begin this analysis. So the Cato Institute is a right-leaning organization for sure.
Very libertarian.
They are libertarian to their core, and they are big proponents of the German miracle. They talk about the German miracle in regards to a bunch of countries that are struggling. I've seen an article comparing the current situation in Argentina, saying that they need a German miracle. So this is very, very prominent in people's minds here. So it's important how we understand what happened. So Cato Institute, they tried to identify how much of the production was because of A, the reforms that were taking place, or B, the general shock of output that happens after war. So keep in mind, half of Germany was just totally destroyed during the war, right? So how much of the initial or the growth of real income was because of the reforms and how much was because of the recovering from the wartime period? So to do this, they plotted Germany's real per capita income from 1840 up to 2000. They plotted that. And now they want to see where was the trend bucked. Well, you can see the trend bucked at World War I and World War II. Large declines and then increases afterwards. So what they needed to do was they needed to build a model that was going to basically just track the trend of time, but account for the years that were shocking to the trend.
Okay.
So they built a model that was just going to be almost like a moving average model, but slightly more sophisticated. It's called an autoregressive model. If any of you have studied statistics out there, you'll know what that means. It's an autoregression model with specific years of importance. So it has like the years of World War I, the year of 1924 hyperinflation. It has the years of World War II. And then after accounting for all those years, Ben, if you could go to page 17 for me and look at the chart at the top of the page, I want you to see that. So plot A is what you would have expected to see if there was no shock times, and plot B is what happened in real life. So we see a slight increase in the years of 1940 to 1950, but it's very, very minuscule. It's genuinely minuscule. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah, in 40 to 50, but the rate of growth so then you have 50 to 60, where the rate of growth from 50 to 60 completely compensates for the shock of the war and gets back exactly to the expected path that would have happened without shocks.
Exactly. And so now the Cato Institute, but that's not the conclusion they draw from this.
Okay.
The Cato Institute looks at the residual plot, which you can see as the next one below. Again, sophomore stats class people in college, get on it, all right? You can see an increase in the rate of change in the 40s and 50s. There's no doubt. But we're talking about 0.01, 0.02 increases in the residuals here. Yeah. Very, very small. Yeah. Very, very small deviations from the mean. But the Cato Institute concludes this. They conclude that there was a growth bonus of approximately 1.5%, which fades into the 1970s. So they conclude that there is strong evidence for a second growth enhancing besides the except for the Reconstruction effect. Yeah. So they're concluding that the reforms accounted for 1.5% more growth in the 1940s and into the 1940s, which doesn't seem like a lot to me.
No.
But
not when you're growing at a rate of 8%.
Right. Not when you're growing at a rate of 8%. It doesn't seem like that. So there's another side to this. So we have the Cato Institute. To summarize, Cato Institute believes that 1.5% of production is specifically caused by the German balanced budget, by the removal of price controls, and by the currency change. Now we have a different view. This was written by Barry Eichengreen and Albrecht Lichtel from the London School of Economics. They propose that there are three fundamental reasons why the German economy grew fast in the 50s and 60s. They believed, one, that workers were becoming more productive as workers were moving from an agricultural economy into an industrial economy. Britain, which they compared Germany to throughout this period, was already in their industrial period. They moved everybody away from low productivity agriculture. Germany hasn't done that yet. So this is Germany moving from low productivity agriculture into industry. They say that structural liberal reforms may have ignited an economic growth potential. That is the second that they propose. And then the third is the general Reconstruction effect. The Reconstruction effect is the rebuilding after wartime. So I want to briefly go through each one of these. Won't be long, and then we can talk about what our conclusions are from this. So workers, let's start with the worker productivity analysis. Workers were becoming more productive as they were moving from agriculture into industry. German GDP per man hour was never as much as 75% of British GDP man hour at any point before the 1950s, but it eventually converged to the same British levels in the 1960s. So it's Germany playing catch up to where Britain already was.
Okay.
Right? So that's one. Then Germany inherited a very large agricultural sector that was dominated by unproductive family farmers. So they had a lot of people ready to move into industry. So between 1950 and 1960, the share of the labor force outside of agriculture rose at an annual rate of 1.1%. This is much faster than other productive economies like France or the United Kingdom.
Okay.
But they say that this can only account for an additional 0.73% of annual GDP growth, which is a very small percentage of the overall 8% average. So they're only able to account for 0.73% of annual GDP growth with this analysis.
Okay.
Right? So it's a small sliver, but it's a small one. Mm-hmm. It's definitely a part of the picture.
Okay.
So then I want to go to the Reconstruction effect. The Reconstruction effect is very, very simple to understand. Very, very simple. Did you rebuild what you had after the war? And so GDP in the three zones of Allied occupied forces of the Federal Republic, they were only 64% of the 1938 levels in 1948.
Wow.
So they had a massive amount to catch right back up on, a massive amount to rebound back to. And so that basically goes to show how much growth potential was really already there prior anybody even put their hands on the scale.
Yeah.
Before anybody did anything, it's like, okay, basically you have 36 percentage points of GDP that's going to come bouncing right back very quick.
Exactly. It's like as soon as we're not being bombed, we can get out there and get this work done.
Exactly. So now they go into the main argument. Did the structural liberal reforms impact the GDP growth? This is the real crux of our understanding, right? So they say that the long-lasting distributional coalitions that were dissolved after the war didn't result in a total factory productivity increase.
Okay, what are you talking about? The long-standing distributional coalitions.
That is the SPD that was in power for like 40 years.
Okay.
So I shouldn't say that, but the SPD was in power throughout the Weimar era.
Okay.
The SPD had a lot of power even in the 1890s, 1900s, 1910s. They had a lot of sway over the German monarchy.
Okay, so distributional coalitions means
welfare state.
Yes, politicians who are more in favor of taxing and distributing the gains.
So Otto von Bismarck, classic German military chancellor, he creates the first like national health care insurance.
Yeah.
He insures every German. It's hyper conservative, but because of distributionist coalitions in the Reichstag, he was forced to make this this compromise with them. Anyway, so that's kind of the point.
So now they were dissolved by the war and the occupation.
Yes.
Okay. Which means
now the liberals are in power.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Socialists are gone, liberals in power now.
Okay.
So, but people are suggesting that maybe the changes that the liberals made weren't as intense as people say they are. They say, so German political leaders at the time sold this as a complete repudiation of Nazi economics, and they wanted to show a clear break from the Nazi governing coalition and their economic interventionist policies. But they believed that much of this selling was just that, selling, not really all that true. They say that differences in the institutional constellation of the policies that followed from it differed surprisingly little between Weimar and post-World War II Germany, and in fact, between Germany and Britain. So they're saying that there really wasn't that much of a difference between German and British or German and pre-Nazi politics.
Okay.
When in the Allied occupied zones, unions were organized along the exact same lines as they were in the 1920s, with some 16 industrial unions, each with a corresponding employer association, and they also participated in the same kind of national congress. So there was like the same type of union organization that was pretty much picked right back up where Weimar left off.
Okay.
Right? Exactly where Weimar left off. After the Nazis killed all the trade unionists that they could, they took the ones that were still alive, put them right back in power.
So structurally, so far, it seems like we're not really looking at much of a difference.
Not with the unions.
No. Okay.
Not with the unions yet.
Yeah.
So now the currency devaluation. The liberals say that this devaluation saw a striking reduction in German working purchasing power, which So they say that the reduction in working purchasing power helped keep prices low and stave off inflation for a while.
Okay.
Now, what the direct initial result of this was, a massive devaluation in their purchasing power actually resulted in a lot of strikes and a lot of unemployment.
Okay.
And this rise in unemployment, this rise in strikes, almost pushed Earnhardt to make a Keynesian jobs program to keep the people who were unemployed from becoming revolutionary.
Like a government jobs guarantee.
Something like it.
Okay.
He never went through with it, but he thought about it.
Okay.
And so I think that kind of shows at least the philosophical underpinnings of the government were not a total repudiation of Keynesianism, because he had this idea at least in his head.
Sure.
Now, in addition to this, in guards of workers' rights, iron and coal, they passed the Co-Determination Act of 1951, and this act placed workers on company boards through representative elections. This allowed them to surveil their employers directly and verify that they were keeping with their investment commitments. So this is putting workers directly in between shareholders and where capital is getting placed. I can't think of a more this seems interventionist to me, maybe not state interventionist, but certainly worker interventionist, right? This is a very worker power move. Yeah. This is something I would like to see in the United States today.
Yeah.
Right? If I could get the Co-Determination Act in the U.S., I would be very happy.
Yes.
Right?
Yes, I'm with you.
So they also argue, so that's all the union stuff. They also argue that the discontinuities in Germany's regulation framework didn't really change that much either. And the authors argue that by today's standards, West Germany in the 1950s was still a tightly regulated economy. We can see this with Earnhardt's decisions to keep price controls in rental markets and agricultural prices. He chooses to keep these rent controls and keep all collective bargaining rights and co-deterministic relationships the same as they were in Weimar.
Yeah.
So that is already, okay, we have workers' rights basically around the same. Mm-hmm. We have some price controls definitely reduced, no doubt about it, but rental price controls are the same and food price controls are the same. He also passed, I think is super important, the Investment Aid Act of 1951. And this act imposed a levy on wide segments of German industry. And so it poured money into coal, steel, and electricity generation, and even transportation funds that improved their output potential. And a lot of this was because they wanted to keep the price of coal stable, and coal prices were kept below cost for a long time. So to make the coal companies solvent, they kept the prices of coal low, but funneled a lot of state money into the coal plants.
Okay.
Where do they find the money to do this? The United States. A lot of this money came through the Marshall Plan. And the Marshall Plan was where the United States gave Germany, Austria, a lot of these destroyed countries more money so that they could build their economies back up. So Germany was keeping the price of coal low for consumers by using state subsidies to keep the industries afloat.
That makes sense.
And they also argue that wage restraint was a big part of it, but a lot of unions were seeing a lot of wage increases of 9 to 10% throughout the 1950s.
Okay.
So basically, there was not that much structural change. The currency was scrapped, and that caused short-term unemployment, short-term inflation, probably long-term stability. Definitely. I definitely think the currency change was positive for long-term stability. But I don't see anything where balanced budgets here were totally coincided with this. Or say, like, a total restructuring of the economic model.
Yeah, well, with the budgets, you wonder what would a lot of debt have done to them?
Right.
I mean, less spending power for the government as they start to pay back interest.
That's so interesting you said that, because it's exactly what the argument of the authors made was the difference between British and German debt at the time period.
Okay.
Because so much more of British deficits, Germany had balanced budgets, but not like completely balanced, obviously. The interest payments Britain had to pay were so much higher than interest payments Germany had to pay. So they had a lot more bang for their buck with each dollar they spent as opposed to each British dollar.
I think that's valid.
Yeah, that's super valid.
Yeah.
That's
hard
super
to argue
valid.
against that.
No, that's a super good point. Like, But what I think the main thing I took from this was the German miracle is kind of a facade. I'm not convinced that the neoliberalization quote unquote of Germany was the reason we saw the 8% growth. I think it was because output was 64% of what it was in 1939. I think it was because they had a lot of people going from farm to industry. And I support this by saying a lot of the policies that Erhard continued with were not very revolutionary in their ideas.
Sure. I don't even know if I would look at it that way. I think it seems unfair to even characterize this as neoliberal, first of all. The way the system is described.
This is not neoliberalism.
Price controls on food and rent, that's not neoliberal at all.
Collective bargaining?
Exactly. Heavy unionization across the economy.
Co-determinism? Workers on corporate boards?
Yeah, it seems silly that Cato tries to take credit or tries to use this as credit to the liberal or the neoliberal cause.
Yes.
Right? So first of all, I throw that out. I think there is credit to be given to these policies.
Yes.
It's just that these policies aren't neoliberal policies.
Yes.
And if they are, then I'm in a lot more agreement with neoliberals than I thought that I was.
If this is neoliberalism, I'm a neoliberal, baby.
Exactly.
If you're going to tell me that workers being on corporate boards is neoliberalism, sign me the F up, dude.
Yeah. So I think the policy can be applauded. And I think we talk about how we don't like massive debts for governments because of the interest they have to pay. We're talking about now how that was probably an engine for growth, is that they weren't weighed down by a massive amount of debt.
Yeah.
So I don't have a problem. I don't push back against that either.
No.
At all.
So I just thought it was a really interesting to dive into. And that takes us into the 1960s. We have a booming, bustling West Germany. East Germany, the only thing I'll say about East Germany is East Germany did see an initial spike of growth very heavy in the 1950s. There's no doubt. East Germany saw a lot of growth in the 1950s, which kind of dies off because of the whole Soviet bloc, directly planned economy, terrible economic model that was Soviet communism. So, but that initial spark, East Germany saw some growth back, which again makes me believe it's Reconstruction effects, accounting for a lot of this. But yeah, I think I agree with you, man. A lot of this is like, maybe these policies had a lot to do with it, and the policies were not neoliberal.